Okay, thank you very much for that introduction and for your earlier presentation. Um, the title of my presentation is Gender Equality, Violence Against Women, and Social Media Technology Towards a New Global Narrative. So it's an honor and pleasure to be here at the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences to partake in this important dialogue in light of China's growing and leading international presence across multiple spheres, especially science and technology. The call by Pope Francis, and is also maintained by Tu Weiming, for an authentic dialogue, and this is with emphasis, within an ethical framework of freedom and equality is especially helpful and hopeful. This framework was also emphasized yesterday by Professor Rocco Buttiglione, who invoked Hegelian individual and political freedom, and by Professor Jiang Sharon, who asked us to consider the danger of reification, or what in philosophy we would call essentialism. Thank you to Professor Pozzo for the invitation to say something on the topic of gender equality, a central topic of my research and teaching in life and in philosophy. Okay. For my presentation, I take guidance from the address of His Holiness Pope Francis to the round table of the Global Foundation about learning compassion for those suffering from persecution, loneliness, forced displacement, or separation from their families. His Holiness also speaks about learning an attitude of suffering with them. So this is this emphasis on learning an attitude of suffering with, learning compassion for those suffering. I would humbly suggest that we consider a small modification here that conveys some recognition that not all people can learn this. Perhaps we might consider the more tentative words of fostering or cultivating an attitude of suffering with them. The reason for suggesting this is that the science of forensic psychiatry, psychology, and studies about morality tell us that not all people can learn compassion or identify with others' suffering, however much we may wish that they can, and however much others try to teach them. These are people, for instance, with narcissistic personality traits, as Professor Buttiglione referred to in passing yesterday, sociopathy and psychopathy, moral conditions that are largely ontological. That is, some people are wired that way and have no qualms about indifference to the plight of others, and especially causing their suffering. And according to experts, there is no therapy or treatment that has been shown to really alter this. Thus, our ability to effectively foster identification with those who are suffering would be enriched and facilitated were it also to include this scientific and other knowledge as part of advancing this noble aim. The political philosopher Hannah Arendt says just as much regarding the larger political sphere in her remarkable classic work, The Origins of Totalitarianism. She breaks down the elements and compares the workings of totalitarianism in their variety of forms, noting that their leadership tends to exhibit precisely these traits of narcissism and psychopathy. This, she warns, limits our ability to effectively engage them without our having deep, nuanced, and complex knowledge about what we're dealing with here. Here, too, she suggests an ontological difference. That is, a difference in kind between democratic political systems that have some measure of checks and balances and those that effectively do not. I take His Holiness's invocation to identify with the suffering of others as a hermeneutical phenomenological form of ethics. It's an expression of Mitsein, meaning being with the other, following as closely as possible their suffering so that out of that proximity, one learns something about the nature of that suffering and helps give it voice. What Pope Francis is suggesting seems to align with the ethics of the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas. For people who are capable of being reached through some identification with the suffering of others, attaining knowledge of that nature, of its nature, and about the ways that that suffering tends to be covered up or minimized, will be a crucial bridge to communicate that suffering to those in positions of responsibility so that they use, as Pope Francis says, their intelligence to make corrections whenever necessary. The topic of gender equality is a vast one, and I center my discussion on that facet which is my expertise. A central factor that has and continues to obstruct gender equality, which for the purposes of this discussion is the social and political equality of men and women, though not the exclusive way to think about this, Is the widespread sexual objectification, abuse, and violence against women and girls, though not only them, in a phenomenon that is historical and global in its scale? We learned about it in recent history precisely through identifying with the suffering of others and by taking our own suffering seriously. This phenomenon cuts across time, cultures, and sectors of society, even if expressed in unique ways in different cultural, social, and political contexts. If a human group, in this case half the world's population, is distinctively targeted for such treatment, and largely with impunity, even where some laws exist against such violations, then that group is not treated in an equal way. It means that we do not have gender equality. This dynamic of sexual objectification, abuse, and violence is so globally pervasive, especially through its dispersal today through social media technology and other new technologies, that it has become normalized such that its harms are hardly visible. This fact of a large-scale but hardly visible problem constitutes a massive obstruction towards achieving gender equality. I'd like to address some key factors that contribute to that invisibility so that we can better move through that obstruction. This gives us another narrative about what is happening and a foundation for exchange of knowledge in addressing manifestations of such abuses globally and in China too, as we seek as a world community to work towards our common goal of gender equality. These key factors center on our modern idea of freedom, just as our previous speaker noted, and about distinctive features of modern technology. Since the time of the Enlightenment, the modern idea of universal freedom was not truly universal, but was distinguished by sex. This means that men were taught or thought by nature to be free in their own way, and women were thought by nature to be free in their own way. There wasn't a common human notion of freedom. Men exercised their freedom in the public, social, and political sphere, while women were said to exercise their special freedom through confinement in the home, their lives consumed by the activity of helping men realize their freedom. Men's freedom also included the liberty to do practically anything to women in their homes with impunity. There weren't then terms for sexual harassment, objectification, domestic violence, rape in marriage, child sexual abuse, because these weren't considered real. This gendered idea of universal freedom served to both advance mass harms to women and girls, and at the same time to cover them up as their different but equal kind of freedom. This gendered idea of universal freedom is at the heart of the 18th century philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau's philosophy of freedom. The 18th century English philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft challenged Rousseau's idea of freedom in her Vindication of the Rights of Woman, a work that would be all but forgotten until the second wave of feminism in the 1970s. This gendered idea of universal freedom is also at the heart of Hegel's philosophy of freedom. This idea of modern freedom that is distinguished by sex has evolved into new forms over the centuries. Today, it especially manifests in a way that covers up the widespread sexual abuses and sex trafficking that are at the base of an increasingly pornographic culture, which is often touted as sexually liberating. Men are liberated in treating women and girls in ways that in fact physically and psychologically violate them, whereas women are said to be liberated by being treated in these ways. Again, a gendered notion of freedom advances mass harms to women and girls at the same time as covering them up as their different but equal kinds of freedom. We need to work towards a common human and global narrative, what we understand freedom to be in this context that isn't a cover for mass abuses. And we need to think about the distinctive roles of technology in proliferating these harms, for instance, making them so ubiquitous that they become normalized, and the ways that individual, group, and state actors organize social media to pillory and shut down voices of survivors who dare to speak out, especially against powerful men. Thank you.